boy nobody wanted, a man who had stopped believing in anything, and one question from a 6-year-old that changed everything. The morning Gareth Ashcombe found Finn Mercer, the temperature had dropped to the kind of cold that kills quietly. No warning, no mercy. The market was loud, people were moving fast, and nobody was looking at the barefoot child beside the broken wagon. Nobody except Elsie. She tugged her father's sleeve and asked the question so simply, so completely without guile, that it cracked something open in Gareth's chest he thought had sealed itself shut years ago. "Dad, can we bring him home?" If you've ever made a decision that rewrote your entire life in a single second, like this video, drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because what happens next will break your heart before it puts it back together. The Bitterstone Highlands in January were not a place for the living. That was how Gareth thought of them, on the mornings when the cold pressed through the cabin walls like something with intention. Not wind, exactly, more like the mountains themselves breathing out, slow and indifferent, reminding whatever small, warm things had made their homes in the folds of rock and timber that they were guests here. Nothing more. The Highlands did not care if you survived. They did not care if your firewood held out, or your snares came up empty 3 days running, or the cough your daughter had been nursing since November settled into something deeper and more stubborn than a cough had any right to be. They simply were, and you either kept moving or you didn't. Gareth Ashcombe had been keeping moving for 4 years. He was not a tall man, but he was built the way the mountains built things. Wide through the shoulder, economical, nothing wasted. His hands were rough and scarred from trapping seasons that stretched back further than he liked to count, and there was a permanent squint around his eyes from years of reading wind and snow and the particular shade of gray a sky turned before it decided to kill you. He was 34 years old and looked 42. And he had stopped minding that somewhere around the time he stopped minding most things. What he had not stopped minding, what he suspected he would never stop minding, no matter how many winters he put between himself and the fact of it, was the boy he hadn't saved. His brother Daniel had been 9 years old. Gareth had been 16, supposed to be watching him. The ice on Coldwater Creek had looked solid. It wasn't. Gareth had stood on the bank screaming for help that came 20 minutes too late. And he had carried the shape of that afternoon with him every day since, the way a man carries a stone in his boot, always there, always pressing, impossible to forget even when he stopped thinking about it directly. He didn't talk about Daniel, not to anyone. He especially didn't talk about it to Elsie, who was 6 years old and had her mother's eyes and her mother's habit of asking questions that had no clean answers. Margaret had died 3 years back. Fever, the traveling doctor said, one of those quick, ruthless winter fevers that moved through mountain settlements like fire through dry grass and left the survivors standing in the ash of their own lives, blinking, trying to remember what they were supposed to do next. Gareth had kept the cabin, kept the trap lines, kept Elsie, who was 3 at the time and probably too young to understand what she'd lost, but old enough to keep asking, "Where's Mama?" for 6 months afterward, each time with the same patient expectation, as though the answer might be different this time. He had answered as honestly as he could, every time. He owed her that much. Elsie Ashcombe at 6 was a force of nature wearing a knitted wool hat. She was small for her age and loud for any age, with Margaret's dark eyes and a laugh that bounced off the cabin rafters, and a habit of conducting extended, serious conversations with the 2 chickens they kept in the lean-to out back. She had named the chickens sergeant and deputy. She had appointed them to positions of authority in a governing structure that only she fully understood. Gareth adored her with a ferocity that sometimes frightened him. She was also the only reason he went to the Millhaven winter market that January, because Elsie had been asking about it for 3 weeks. "Can we go, Papa? Can we? You said maybe means yes sometimes, doesn't it?" And he needed salt and nails and a new awl handle. And he supposed he also needed, though he would not have said it this way, to be somewhere with other people for a few hours. Even if he didn't talk to them. Even if he just moved through the crowd like a stone through water, picking up what he came for, buying Elsie a piece of hard candy from the general goods stall if old Perkins still carried them, and going home. Millhaven wasn't much of a town. 14 buildings, 2 of which were the same saloon on different days of the week, and a population that swelled in winter when the weather drove people in from the outlying homesteads and thinned again in spring when everyone scattered back to their land. The market ran 3 days in mid-January. Booths set up in the broad snow-packed square between the livery and the dry goods store. People trading furs and dried meat and tool parts and gossip. Children running between adult legs, dogs getting underfoot. Somebody usually playing a fiddle badly near the fire barrel. It smelled like wood smoke and horse and fried bread. And it was, despite everything, the most alive Gareth felt all winter. He had Elsie up on his shoulders because the crowd was thick and she wanted to see, and she was providing a running commentary on everything she spotted. Papa, there's a dog. Papa, that lady has the biggest coat. Papa, look at those furs. Are those fox? You said fox looked different than coyote, but they look the same to me. And he was half listening, half navigating toward Perkins' stall when Elsie went quiet. With Elsie, quiet was unusual enough to notice. "What?" he said. "Papa?" Her voice had changed, not excited anymore, something different. "Papa, stop." He stopped. "There's a boy." She said it the way she said important things, slow, deliberate, making sure he understood she meant it. "Over by that wagon, the one that's broken." He looked where she was pointing. The wagon sat at the edge of the market square, one wheel off the axle and leaning against a post, apparently abandoned mid-repair. Beside it, almost against the wheel, as if trying to use it as windbreak, sat a child. Gareth's first thought was that the child was too still. People in cold like this didn't sit still. You kept moving or you generated heat some other way, stomping, rubbing your arms, ducking into a doorway. Sitting still in 14 below wind was the first stage of dying, and most people who'd grown up in the Highlands understood that without being told. The boy wasn't moving. He was maybe 8 or 9, hard to tell from distance. Thin. That was the next thing Gareth registered. The particular hollowness of a child who hasn't been eating enough for long enough that it shows in the shape of his face. The way his coat, not a coat, Gareth realized as he moved closer, a man's shirt several sizes too large, wrapped around him and belted with a piece of rope, hung off him like something off a scarecrow. His feet were bare. Not boots with no socks, not wrapped rags, bare. In January, in the Bitterstone Highlands, something moved in Gareth's chest. Something he recognized and didn't want to. "Papa." Elsie's voice was very quiet now, just above his ear. "He doesn't have any shoes." "I see that." "He's cold." "I know." He stood there. Around them the market moved and chattered, and someone laughed loud at something, and the fiddle started up again badly, and 3 people walked past the wagon without looking at the boy, and Gareth stood there long enough that Elsie leaned down and put her face close to his. "Can we bring him home?" she asked. He should have said something sensible. He should have said, "We don't know who he belongs to," or "Someone else is probably looking for him," or "It's not our business, Bug." He should have said any of the reasonable things a reasonable man says when he's trying not to get involved in something that will cost him more than he can afford. He said, "Let me go talk to him first." The boy's name was Finn. He didn't offer it easily. Gareth crouched down in front of him, setting Elsie on her feet first, keeping her close behind him, and the boy watched him come the way animals watched when they'd been hurt enough times to stop assuming approach meant kindness. His eyes were a pale gray-green, remarkable eyes, though at the moment they were set in a face that was dirty and pinched with cold and arranged in the careful blankness of someone who had learned that showing fear was dangerous. "Hey," Gareth said. The boy said nothing. "You cold?" The boy's jaw was tight, from cold or from refusing to let his teeth chatter, one or the other. He gave a very small nod, like he was rationing the admission. "Where are your shoes?" A pause. "Lost 'em." The flatness of it. Not, "I lost them," or "they got took," or, I don't know, just "lost 'em," the 2 words of someone who had learned not to give details because details could be used against you. Gareth filed that away without comment. "Your family around here somewhere?" Something shifted in the boy's face, brief, quickly controlled. "No." "You come to market with someone?" "No." "How'd you get here?" The boy looked past him for a moment toward the edge of the square and then back. "Walked." From where, Gareth didn't ask yet. From the look of the child's feet, cracked, bluish at the toes, the kind of damage that took more than an afternoon, from somewhere that was not close. "Okay," Gareth said. He stood. Okay. He looked down at Finn, and Finn looked up at him, still with that careful nothing expression. And Gareth thought about Daniel on the bank of Coldwater Creek, and then made himself stop thinking about it. You're coming with me to get something to eat. After that, we'll figure out the rest. I don't need your help, the boy said. His voice came out steadier than it should have, from a child who was half frozen and alone. I know you don't, Gareth said. Come anyway. On. He bought Finn a bowl of stew from the cook fire near the livery, and the boy ate it the way starving animals eat, fast, hunched over the bowl, not looking up, like someone might take it. He ate every bit of it, and then sat with the empty bowl and didn't ask for more, which told Gareth more than any direct question would have. A child who asks for more still believes he might get it. A child who sits quietly with an empty bowl has learned that asking only makes things worse. Elsie sat next to Finn and watched him with the frank, unsettling focus of a 6-year-old who had no concept of staring being rude. Do you like chickens? She asked when he'd finished. Finn looked at her. What? Chickens. I have 2, Sergeant and Deputy. Deputy's the one with the spot on her beak. Sergeant is kinda mean, but I think she's just misunderstood. Finn stared at her. Gareth could see him processing this, trying to fit it into whatever map of the world he'd been working from, and finding that it didn't quite slot anywhere familiar. I don't know, Finn said finally. I never had a chicken. You can meet mine, Elsie said, with the confidence of someone who has never been turned down in her life. We're going home after. You can come. Finn looked at Gareth. Gareth looked back. We'd need to get you some boots first, Gareth said. He got the boy boots at the dry goods counter. Heavy ones, nearly right-sized, which seemed like luck until Gareth thought about it and realized it wasn't luck so much as the fact that the child's feet were swollen from the cold and would shrink back some once he was warm. He bought wool socks. He bought a coat from a woman selling second-hand winter gear from the back of a cart. Not pretty, but solid, sheepskin lined, the right size more or less. While he was paying for it, the woman who sold him the coat leaned in and said, Quiet. You know there were men through here this morning asking about a runaway boy. Gareth kept his face neutral. That's so. 3 of them. Big fella in a black coat doing most of the talking said they had a child in their care who'd wandered off, said there'd be a reward. What kind of men were they? She looked at him levelly. The kind you don't ask too many questions of. Gareth nodded once, tucked the coat under his arm, and walked back to where Finn and Elsie were waiting. On the ride home, Finn on the horse in front of him, Elsie tucked between them, all of them under a shared blanket because the temperature had dropped another 5 degrees and the sky was the color of iron. Gareth asked the question he'd been circling since the market. Finn, how'd you end up in Millhaven? Long silence. Snow squeaked under the horses' hooves. Wind came at them sideways off the ridge. Ran, the boy said. Ran from what? Another silence, longer. There's a place, Finn said finally. His voice was very flat. Up past the ridgeline, past the second fork in the Bitterstone Road. They call it a workhouse, but it's... He stopped, started again. There's a man named Granger. He has papers that say he's guardian of kids who don't have parents. He takes them and they work. The farm, the mine, the timber, whatever he needs. A pause. They don't get paid. They don't go anywhere. They just work until they can't, and then... He stopped again. Then what? Gareth asked. His voice came out quieter than he intended. Finn didn't answer right away. When he did, he said it the way he'd said lost 'em. Flat, stripped of everything that would make it feel like more than a fact. Then they're gone, and there's a new kid. The wind hit them from the north. Elsie had fallen asleep against Gareth's chest, small and warm and unconscious of what was being said over her head. Gareth said nothing for a long time after that. Then he said, How long were you there? 2 years? A breath. I think, maybe longer. It was hard to keep track. How old are you? 9. A pause. I think 9. Gareth tightened his grip on the reins. The horse's breath made small clouds in the dark air. The cabin was another 40 minutes up the mountain. Okay, he said. We're almost home. I'm not going back, Finn said. Not threatening, not pleading, just stating it with the finality of someone who had made a decision they intended to die with if necessary. "I'd rather freeze out here than go back." "You're not going back," Gareth said. Finn turned his head slightly, just enough to look at Gareth from the corner of his eye, trying to gauge whether it was true, whether it was the kind of thing adults said. "I mean that," Gareth said. "You're not going back." The cabin was not large. One main room with the fireplace, a sleeping loft where Elsie had her cot, a back room where Gareth slept and kept his gear. There was a kitchen corner with the iron stove, a table with 2 chairs that Gareth had made himself badly during the first winter after Margaret died when he needed something to do with his hands, a braided rug on the floor that Margaret had made before Elsie was born. Finn stood in the middle of it and looked around with an expression that Gareth couldn't immediately name. Not wonder, exactly. More like a man who has been told there's water and doesn't believe it and is afraid to reach for it in case his hand goes through. "This is your house?" he said. "Yeah. Just you and..." He glanced at Elsie, who was awake now and pulling off her boots. "Her?" "Just us." Finn nodded slowly. Then he looked at the fireplace, where the banked coals were still giving off heat, and Gareth watched the boy's shoulders drop about an inch. Just that. Just the smallest letting go. "Sit by the fire," Gareth said. "I'll get it built back up." "I can help," Finn said immediately. "I know. Sit anyway." The boy sat. Gareth built the fire. Elsie produced a blanket from somewhere and draped it over Finn with the solemn officiousness of someone conducting a ceremony, and Finn held it around himself and watched the flames and said nothing. And Gareth put water on for something hot to drink and didn't say anything either, because there were no words yet for whatever this was. He thought about the men the woman at the market had described. The big one in the black coat. Men who'd been asking around, describing a boy, talking about reward money and guardianship papers. He thought about Finn saying, "I'd rather freeze out here." He thought about Daniel. He hung the boy's new coat on the peg by the door next to Elsie's, and his own, 3 in a row, and stood there looking at them for a moment longer than made sense, and then he turned back to the room. "You'll sleep in the loft tonight," he told Finn. "Elsie won't mind, will you, Bug?" Elsie was already halfway up the ladder. "I'm not a baby. I don't mind sharing," she announced from above. Finn looked up at her, then back at Gareth. "Thank you," he said, very quietly, like he wasn't sure if it was allowed. "Get some sleep," Gareth said. "It's cold tonight, Woots." Long after the children were asleep, he could hear Elsie's deep, even breathing, and eventually the slightly less even breathing of a boy who'd probably slept badly for 2 years and was only now beginning to understand that sleeping might be safe. Gareth sat at the table in the firelit dark and thought. He had a 9-year-old in his house who had run from a man who had papers. Papers in his experience mattered more than was fair and less than people with papers liked to pretend, but they mattered enough. He had never been to the territorial court in Redhaven. He had been to Millhaven a dozen times, to the magistrate's office twice, once to settle a boundary dispute with old Carver about a trap line, and once when Margaret's estate, such as it was, needed to be properly recorded. He was not a man who moved comfortably in legal spaces. He was also not a man who handed children back to the people they'd risked their lives to get away from. That was not a complicated position. He'd arrived at it quickly, and it didn't seem like it was going to shift. What was complicated was everything else. The men who were already looking, the papers, the kind of men the woman at the market had described, the kind you don't ask too many questions of, which meant the kind with enough money or enough violence to make questions stop. He'd built his life up here to be quiet, to be simple, to be the kind of life where what happened to him stopped mattering quite so much, because there was Elsie to look after, and the trap lines to run, and the firewood to split, and 100 small specific tasks that kept a man occupied and kept him from thinking about all the ways a life could break and keep on breaking. He'd gotten good at small and specific. He wasn't sure he still knew how to do anything else. He sat there until the fire burned down to coals, and then he fed it 2 more logs and went to the window and looked out at the darkness of the mountain, at the snow that was starting to come down again, slow and steady, covering the tracks that led to his door. Tomorrow it would look as though no one had come. He put his hand on the cold glass and thought, whatever comes, he's not going back. He went to bed. In the loft, a boy who hadn't slept safely in years was breathing slow and even for the first time in longer than he could remember, and outside the snow fell on the Bitterstone Highlands without caring about any of it, and the mountains kept on being mountains, and for one night at least the cabin was warm. The snow kept coming for 4 days after they brought Finn home. Not a gentle snowfall. The Bitterstone kind. The kind that meant business. That stacked itself against the cabin walls until the bottom of the window disappeared and the door needed a hard shoulder to open each morning. Wind came down off the high ridge at night and made the walls creak and groan in a way that Elsie had long ago decided was the mountain talking, though she'd never specified what it was saying. Probably nothing good, Gareth figured, given the tone. He didn't mind being snowed in. He'd planned for it the way he planned for everything up here. Wood stacked 4 feet deep under the lean-to, dried meat and preserved vegetables, and enough flour and salt to last 6 weeks if they weren't stupid about it. The trap lines would wait. The mountain would still be there when the storm broke. What he hadn't planned for was a 9-year-old boy who woke up screaming at 3 a.m. The first night it happened, Gareth was up and across the room with his hand on the rifle before he was fully awake. Muscle memory from years of living alone on a mountain where sounds in the dark meant something. Then he heard it. Not an intruder, not the particular quality of threat he'd been bracing for, but a child's voice, high and sharp and terrified, and he set the rifle down and went up the ladder in 3 steps. Finn was sitting up on the cot, both hands pressed flat against the mattress like he was checking whether it was real, his chest heaving. Elsie hadn't woken up. She slept like a stone, always had. Gareth crouched at the edge of the cot. "Hey," he said. "Quiet. You're here. You're okay." Finn looked at him. His eyes were wild for a moment, the eyes of someone still half inside whatever they'd been seeing, and then something settled, slowly, and he looked around the loft and seemed to come back to himself. "Sorry," he said. Automatic, reflexive. The apology of someone who'd been trained to apologize for inconvenience. "Don't be. You want some water?" Finn nodded. Gareth went down and got the cup and came back up, and Finn drank half of it and sat there holding it with both hands, which were still not quite steady. "You don't have to tell me," Gareth said. "I know," Finn said. A pause. "It was just... I keep thinking I'm back there. When I wake up, I don't know where I am for a second." "That'll get better," Gareth said. He believed it. He wasn't certain, but he believed it. Finn looked at him sideways. "How do you know?" Gareth sat down on the floor with his back against the wall, which was not the most comfortable position he'd ever been in, but put him at the boy's level without looming over him. "I don't, exactly, but things that happen to you in the dark, they lose some of their grip once you've been somewhere safe long enough." He paused. "In my experience," Finn considered this. He seemed to be the kind of child who considered things before he spoke, who had learned that words had consequences and wanted to be sure about them before releasing them. "You had something like that?" Gareth looked at the rafters. The wood was dark with age and smoke and time. "Yeah," he said. "Something like that." He didn't say more and Finn didn't push, which Gareth appreciated. They sat in the quiet for a while, the wind hitting the roof in irregular gusts, Elsie breathing steadily 3 feet away, completely undisturbed by all of it. "She sleeps like she doesn't believe anything bad can happen," Finn said. He was watching her with something complicated in his face. "She mostly hasn't had it," Gareth said. "I'd like to keep it that way." Finn nodded. He handed the cup back, lay back down, pulled the blanket up. He didn't say anything else, and Gareth went back down the ladder and sat by the banked fire for a while before going back to bed. It happened twice more that week. The second time, Gareth made the water trip again. The third time, Finn was already calming himself back down before Gareth got up the ladder, and when Gareth appeared at the top, the boy just shook his head. "I'm all right." And that was that. Something small, but Gareth noticed it. Quote, "The rhythms of the cabin shifted to accommodate 3 people with less friction than Gareth had expected and more negotiation than he was used to." Elsie ran the social schedule. She had decided within 48 hours that Finn was acceptable company and within 72 that he was her preferred companion for all activities, which meant Finn spent his first week in the cabin being introduced to sergeant and deputy at length, shown the proper technique for checking if ice was thick enough before stepping on it, Elsie's technique, which mostly consisted of tapping it with 1 foot from a position of relative safety, and taught a card game that Elsie claimed to have invented, but which bore strong structural similarities to Go fish with a scoring system that seemed to benefit the inventor. Finn went along with most of it. He was careful, watchful, always scanning the door, the window, the trail. But the scanning was getting slightly less constant, Gareth noticed, as the days went on and nothing came. Gareth taught him other things: how to split wood without taking a finger off, how to read the fire to know when it needed feeding, how to check if the flue was drawing right before you built up to full heat. Small things, practical things, the 1,000 small competencies that kept a person alive in the highlands through winter. Finn picked them up fast, not showing off about it, just absorbing the way certain children do, watching once, maybe twice, and then doing it. He was precise with his hands, careful, attentive to detail. "You've worked before," Gareth said one afternoon, watching Finn repack a snare trap with a dexterity that should have taken weeks to learn. I mean, really worked. Not kid chores. Finn set the trap down and didn't look up for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "The timber? At Granger's?" A pause. "Timber, farming, some mining, mostly timber." He looked up. "He hired us out sometimes. To other operations. That's how I learned the snares. Old man at a fur outfit south of the ridge. He wasn't as bad as most. But still bad. He didn't hit us," Finn said, which was a sentence that contained a great deal. Gareth let the silence sit. He'd learned already that Finn talked about his time at the camp in pieces, sideways, when he wasn't bracing for it, when his hands were busy and his eyes were somewhere else. Pushing directly didn't work. Waiting did. "How many kids are there now?" he asked after a while. Casual, looking at his own hands. Finn's jaw tightened. "When I left? 11. But that changes." A pause. "Younger ones. Mostly younger ones now." Gareth thought about 11 children in a camp past the second fork in the Bitterstone Road and kept his face even. "All right," he said. "Let me show you how to reset the tension so it doesn't spring too soon, Swan." The first time Finn laughed, it surprised both of them. It was the second week, and Elsie had talked Finn into helping her with what she called an engineering project, which turned out to be an attempt to build a small shelter for sergeant and deputy out of scrap wood from the bin, on the grounds that the lean-to got too drafty in the real cold, and the chickens had complained. Gareth was watching from the cabin door with a cup of coffee that was already mostly cold, which was the only temperature coffee achieved in the highlands in winter. The shelter collapsed twice. The second time it fell, it took the stack of firewood beside it down with a tremendous crash, and Sergeant bolted in one direction and Deputy bolted in the other, and Elsie sat in the snow with wood scattered all around her, looking at the wreckage with an expression of total philosophical devastation. And Finn, who had been trying to hold the back panel steady when the whole thing went, started laughing. Not a polite laugh. Not even a surprised laugh. A real one, loud and a little helpless, the kind that happens before you can decide whether to let it. He stopped almost immediately, like he'd startled himself. But Elsie, who was not capable of staying devastated for long in the presence of anyone laughing, started laughing too, and then the whole thing built on itself the way it does, the laughter feeding off the collapsed shelter and the indignant chickens and each other. And Gareth watched from the doorway and felt something shift in his chest. The boy had a good laugh, easy and genuine, when he let it out. His whole face changed. He didn't notice Gareth watching, and Gareth didn't say anything about it. He just went inside and added wood to the fire and pretended he'd had cold coffee by choice. The knock came on a Tuesday. Gareth knew it was bad before he opened the door, not because of any particular intuition, but because it was the middle of a snowstorm, and no one who meant well traveled in the middle of a snowstorm in the Bitterstone Highlands. Neighbors didn't. Traders didn't. Travelers in genuine distress knocked differently, frantic, weak, with the particular quality of desperation that was unmistakable. This knock was deliberate, spaced. The knock of a man who wasn't in a hurry because he didn't need to be. Gareth was already on his feet. He caught Finn's eye across the room. The boy had frozen mid-motion, a piece of kindling in his hand, and the color had gone out of his face, and jerked his head toward the back room. Finn was moving before Gareth finished the gesture. He took Elsie's hand on the way, not roughly, just firm, and pulled her with him, and Gareth heard the backroom door close with barely a sound. He pulled on his coat, picked up the rifle from beside the door. Didn't put it in his hands yet, just carried it loose, at his side, available. He opened the door. There were 3 of them. The one in front was big. Not tall exactly, but wide. The build of a man who had spent years doing things that required physical force, with a black coat that had seen better decades, and a face like weathered boot leather, deeply creased, with small eyes set too close together that were currently arranged in an expression of pleasant authority. Behind him, 2 men who were younger and less interesting, and who had the particular posture of men who were there to provide numbers. "Morning," the man in the black coat said. He had a voice that was smooth in a way that didn't match his face. "Sorry to trouble you in this weather. Name's Silas Granger. I run an operation out past the ridge." Gareth looked at him and said nothing. "We're looking for a boy," Granger continued. He reached into his coat, unhurried, demonstrating that he wasn't reaching for anything threatening, just papers, and produced a folded document. "Finn Mercer, 9 years of age. I have legal guardianship of the child. He went missing from our facility about 10 days back, and we've been searching." He held out the papers. "I'd appreciate you taking a look. You may have seen something." Gareth didn't take the papers. "No boy here." "Well," Granger smiled, didn't reach his eyes. It never had. Gareth could tell that from looking at him. "Someone at the market thought they saw a man matching your description with an extra child around the time Finn went missing. Could be a misunderstanding, of course. I don't want to cause trouble." "Then don't," Gareth said. Granger tilted his head slightly. The smile stayed in place. "Now, friend, let's not—" "I'm not your friend." Gareth's voice was flat. "And there's no boy here. I'm going to ask you to get off my land now." Something moved behind Granger's eyes. A calculation. An assessment of what he was dealing with and what it would cost. "I have papers," he said. "Legal guardianship, filed with the territorial—" "I said get off my land." Gareth shifted the rifle, not raising it, not yet, just making sure Granger registered that it was there. "I won't say it a third time." A silence that had weather in it, pressure, the feeling before a break. Then Granger folded the papers and put them back in his coat. He looked at Gareth for another moment, the pleasant expression gone now, something cooler in its place. "You're making a mistake," he said, quietly. Not threatening exactly, just stating it. "Wouldn't be the first," Gareth said. Granger held his gaze another second, then turned and walked back through the snow. His 2 men followed. They had horses at the edge of the clearing. Good horses, well-fed, not working animals. Gareth watched them mount and ride back down the trail until the snow closed behind them. He shut the door. Stood with his hand on it for a moment. The backroom door opened. Finn stood in the doorframe with Elsie beside him, and the boy's face was the color of old ash. "That was him," Finn said. Not a question. "Yeah." Finn's hands were shaking. He pressed them flat against his thighs. "He's not going to stop." "I know." "He never stops." His voice cracked on the last word, the first time Gareth had heard it do that, and it cost Finn something. Gareth could see him hating it, the cracking, hating the evidence of fear. "He found me in 2 weeks. I thought... I went far, I was careful. I didn't think he'd... Shut... Finn." Gareth crossed the room and crouched down so they were level, the way he had in the loft. "Look at me." The boy looked at him. "He's not taking you. You hear me? Those papers don't change what I said." "He's got connections," Finn said. "He's got people in Red Haven, the magistrate, someone at the land office. He talks about it. How nobody can touch him because he's got..." "Finn." He waited until the boy's breathing slowed a fraction. "I'm not hiding from him, and I'm not running from him, but I'm also not going to fight him with a rifle if there's another way." Finn stared at him. "What other way?" Gareth stood up. He looked at the door, and then at the window, and then at the 2 children in his backroom doorway, and thought about what he was committing to and whether he was capable of it. "Legal," he said. "We fight it legal. He's got papers. We get better ones." Elsie, who had been very quiet through all of this, said, "Can we eat first?" Gareth looked at her. Despite everything, despite the weight of what had just happened and what it meant, something almost like a laugh moved through his chest. "Yeah, Bug," he said. "We can eat first." Well, that night, after the children were in the loft and the fire was low, Gareth wrote a letter. He was not a practiced letter writer. His handwriting was functional and not much more. The letters uneven, the lines not quite straight without ruled paper. He wrote to a man named Eldon Graves, who had been the closest thing Millhaven had to a proper lawyer for the past 15 years before moving his practice to Red Haven 3 years back. Gareth had met him twice, both times briefly, both times for other people's business. He didn't know if Graves was any good. He didn't know much about the legal world that Granger apparently moved through with such comfortable authority. What he knew was that he didn't know enough, and that ignorance here was going to cost him. He wrote what he could. He described Finn, age, condition, what the boy had told him about the camp. He described the men who'd come to his door and the papers Granger had waved around. He described the children Finn said were still there, 11 when he left, possibly fewer now, and what the boy had said about kids who stopped appearing. He wrote, "I am not a man who knows courts, but I am a man who knows right from wrong, and I will need help telling one from the other in legal language. Whatever your fee, I will pay it. Write back if you're willing." He sealed it, wrote Graves's name and the Red Haven address on the outside. He'd get it to the post rider next time the weather broke. He sat back and looked at the fire. He had not felt this level of low-grade dread since the winter after Margaret died, when the sheer logistics of keeping a 3-year-old alive alone in the mountains had pressed on him from all sides, and he'd moved through each day with the feeling of a man carrying too much across uncertain ground, not sure each step would hold. This was different. This had an opponent. In some ways, that was worse. In other ways, he thought about Granger's small, close-set eyes, the way the man had said, "You're making a mistake," with that flat confidence, the confidence of someone who had said it before and been right before. In other ways, it was clarifying. He could be scared and still not move. He'd learned that much. Above him, the loft was quiet. 2 children breathing in the dark, one of them for the first time in 2 years in a place with a door that locked from the inside. A small thing. A thing most people never noticed about their own homes. Gareth noticed it. He banked the fire for the night and went to bed, and if he lay awake for 2 hours before sleep came, that was between him and the dark, and in the morning he would get up and tend the fire and feed the children and start working on what came next. The letter to Eldon Graves went out with the post rider on the first clear morning after the storm broke, and then there was nothing to do but wait. Waiting was something Gareth had gotten competent at over the years. It was part of trapping, part of mountain living. The understanding that you set the thing in motion and then you let it move at its own pace, and you didn't stand over it expecting it to hurry. But this was a different kind of waiting, the kind with a shape to it, the kind where you found yourself checking the trail from the window more than you needed to, and sleeping lighter than usual, and cataloging the sounds the mountain made at night with more attention than was comfortable. Granger hadn't come back. That didn't mean he wasn't out there. Finn knew it too. The boy had gotten better, genuinely better, in the small daily ways that mattered. But Granger's visit had set something back. Not all the way back, not to those first days of flinching at sounds and eating like he expected the bowl to be taken. More like a layer had been peeled off, and underneath it was the part of Finn that still believed, at some fundamental animal level, that safety was temporary and the other shoe was always in the air. He checked the window, too. Gareth had seen him do it, quick, sideways, trying not to make it obvious, not making a production of his fear, just checking. They didn't talk about it directly. Gareth wasn't sure that was the right call, but he didn't know what the right call was, and Finn didn't seem to want to discuss it, and so they moved around it the way you move around furniture in the dark, carefully, by feel, trying not to knock anything over. What they did instead was work. February in the Highlands had its own specific character, the coldest month, the one that tested everything you'd built against winter and found the weak points. The cabin needed 2 new chinks in the north wall where the cold was getting through. One of the snare lines had gone unharvested for too long during the storm and needed resetting entirely. The horse needed more feed than Gareth had planned for because the grazing under the snow was too thin and the animal had lost condition. There was always something. Finn threw himself into the work with a focus that sometimes crossed into something else. Urgency, maybe, or the need to be necessary, to earn his place in a way that felt solid and provable. Gareth recognized it. He'd done the same thing after Margaret died, filling every hour until he was too tired to think. He let Finn work. He worked alongside him. He didn't say you don't have to earn this because saying it once hadn't changed anything, and saying it twice would just be noise. Some things you had to learn, by not having them taken away. It was Elsie who came up with the river idea, which meant it was partly Elsie's fault, though Gareth would never have said that to her, and it wasn't really true either. She'd wanted to check on the beaver dam downstream. She'd decided the beavers were her beavers and required monitoring, and Finn had offered to go with her while Gareth worked on the wall chinking, and Gareth had said yes because the river was only a quarter mile, and Finn was capable, and the morning was cold but clear, and he needed 2 hours with his hands in the wall without worrying about what was happening elsewhere. That was the logic. It was reasonable logic. He heard Elsie screaming from inside the cabin wall. The scream had a specific quality. Not startled, not the shriek she made when Sergeant pecked her unexpectedly, but the high sustained note of real terror. And Gareth was moving before he had processed what it meant, out the door and down the slope toward the river at a run that was too fast for the snow conditions, and he knew it and ran anyway. He heard the ice before he saw what had happened. That sound, the deep flat crack that traveled through ice like a gunshot, and meant the structural integrity was already gone, already compromised from the inside. And then he came over the small rise and saw the river. The beaver pond had thin ice near the bank where the water moved slower, and it was there that Finn had gone through. He was into his chest, arms flat on the surface, trying to distribute his weight, and the ice around him was fracturing in a slow, terrible radius, and Elsie was on the bank 6 feet away screaming his name with her hands over her mouth, not moving, which was the right thing to do even if she didn't know it was. Finn's face was turned toward the bank, and his expression was very still, in the way that faces get when the body has already started making calculations about survival and the mind is trying to keep up. "Don't move," Gareth said, to both of them. He was already looking at the ice, reading it, the way he'd been reading ice since he was 12 years old, tracing the fault lines, finding the solid sections. "Finn, look at me. Don't push down on the ice. Keep your arms flat. You hear me?" "Yeah." Finn's voice was controlled. Tight, but controlled. "Elsie, back up 10 steps and stay there." He heard her moving without looking. He was already down at the bank, lying flat on the snow, distributing his own weight the way you had to, beginning to crawl forward on his stomach across the surface. The ice under him groaned. He kept moving. "You didn't stop." Stopping didn't help anything. "I'm coming to you," he said. "Don't try to pull yourself out yet." "My legs," Finn started. "I know. Don't kick, don't push, wait for me." The ice cracked again beneath him, a new fracture line spreading 2 feet to his left, and Gareth stopped breathing for a second and then kept moving. He had his coat belt in his hands. He'd pulled it off his coat before he got on the ice, working by instinct. And he was sliding it out ahead of him now, like a rope, getting it as far toward Finn as he could. He was close enough to see Finn's face clearly. The boy was pale, lips already going thin, the cold working fast. But his eyes were locked on Gareth, and they were steady. Scared, yes. Steady underneath it. "Grab this," Gareth said. "Both hands. When I say pull, you kick like hell, and I'll drag. Don't fight toward me, let me do the pulling." Finn got both hands around the belt. His grip was already clumsy from the cold. "Ready?" A nod. "Pull." He pulled. The ice at the edge of the hole gave way further, which he'd expected, and for one bad second Finn dropped another inch before the drag overcame the crumbling edge, and then the boy was coming up, slow and then all at once, the water releasing him with a sound like a held breath let out. And Gareth was already moving backward, pulling him across the ice, keeping them both flat and moving until they were on solid surface and then on the bank. He got them both to shore, and then his legs went a little, and he sat down hard in the snow and Finn collapsed next to him, soaked and shaking, and Elsie arrived and threw herself at both of them with a force that nearly knocked Gareth sideways. "Get up," Gareth said. He got an arm under Finn and hauled him upright. "We have to move. Wet and cold will kill you faster than the water did. We have to get you warm right now." Finn was already nodding. He was shaking hard enough that his teeth weren't chattering so much as clattering, a sound that set Gareth's own teeth on edge. But he was upright and moving, and that was what mattered. They got back to the cabin in 7 minutes. Gareth had timed faster routes in his head before. Not for this, not exactly, but for the general category of emergency requiring rapid return. And they took the straightest one, Finn moving under his own power with Gareth's hand at his back, Elsie keeping pace without being told to be quiet for once. Inside, fire built high, wet clothes off, blankets, the spare wool sweater that had been Margaret's, and was enormous on a 9-year-old, but was dry and warm. Hot water on the stove. Gareth checked Finn's feet and hands. The fingertips were white at the tips, which meant the circulation had been compromised, and he rubbed them steadily and methodically while Finn sat wrapped in everything Gareth owned that would hold heat. "Wiggle your fingers," Gareth said. Finn wiggled them. It wasn't great, but it was movement. Toes. Same. "You're all right," Gareth said. "You're going to be all right." Finn looked at him. He was still shaking, but less violently. His color was starting to come back in patches. He said quietly, "You crawled out on bad ice." "Yeah. You could have gone through." "I know." Finn stared at him, something working behind his eyes that Gareth couldn't read exactly. "Why?" he said. It was a genuine question, not rhetorical, not dramatic, an actual why, the kind that came from a child who had spent enough time in a world where people did not crawl out onto dangerous ice for him, who needed to understand the calculation, because he genuinely could not follow the math. Gareth looked at him for a moment. "Because you're mine," he said. He hadn't planned the word, and it came out blunter than he intended, and for a second it hung there between them, too much or too simple or both. Finn's face did something then that it hadn't done before. Not the laugh from the collapsed chicken shelter, not the careful, controlled nothing face, not the nightmare face. Something that cracked open briefly and closed again quickly, the way light comes through a shutter before someone can close it. He didn't say anything. "Drink that," Gareth said, putting the hot cup in his hands. "All of it." Finn drank. Elsie, who had been sitting on the rug with her knees pulled to her chest, watching all of this with enormous eyes, said very quietly, "I'm sorry, it was my idea to go to the beaver pond." "It was an accident," Gareth said. "I should have checked the ice first. You always say check the ice." "You were right to stay on the bank," Gareth said. "That was right." "You didn't panic. That was right too." She thought about this. "I was panicking inside." "Inside is okay. Outside is what matters." Finn, who had been staring at the fire, turned to look at Elsie. "You were good," he said. His voice came out rough and warm at the same time, and it clearly surprised him to have said it, but he held on to it. "You didn't do anything stupid. That was good." Elsie looked at him with the full force of her dark eyes and said, "You scared me." "I know. I'm sorry." "Don't fall in rivers," she said. "I won't." "Promise." Finn glanced at Gareth, who kept his face neutral and did not rescue him from this. "I promise," Finn said. Elsie nodded, apparently satisfied, and unfolded herself from the rug and went to check on the chickens. Finn was quiet for the rest of that day. Not the watchful quiet of his first days in the cabin. This was different, more interior. He sat by the fire and ate what Gareth put in front of him and helped with the dinner dishes and didn't volunteer much, and Gareth left him to it. It was after Elsie had gone up to the loft and the cabin was down to just firelight that Finn spoke. "Nobody ever came for me before," he said. "When something went wrong at the camp. If you got hurt, you worked through it. If you got sick, you—" He stopped. Started differently. "There was a kid when I first got there. Tobias. He was 7, I think. He got sick in the fall, real sick, and they put him in the storage shed to keep him from the others, and his jaw worked. I brought him food when I could, snuck it, but I couldn't. I wasn't able to." He stopped again. "You were 9, Gareth said. 8. A pause. 8.5, maybe. You did what you could. It wasn't enough." Gareth looked at the fire. He knew that shape, that particular weight, the thing you carry for someone you couldn't save when you were too young and too small and didn't have enough. He knew it from the inside out. "No," he said. "It wasn't. That's true. And it wasn't your job to make it enough. You were 8 years old and you snuck food to a sick kid when the alternative was doing nothing. That's not nothing." Finn said nothing for a moment. Then, "I keep thinking about the ones still there." "I know." 11 kids. His voice dropped. "Maybe fewer now." "I know," Gareth said again. "That's why we fight this in court and not just for you. What you tell them about that camp. That's what gets those kids out." Finn looked at him, really looked, the way he sometimes did when he was deciding whether something was true or just something adults said to make him feel better. You think they'll listen? He said. I think if you tell the truth in front of the right people, it becomes very hard to ignore. He paused. I'm not going to promise you the law always works the way it should. I'd be lying, but I'm going to promise you I'll stand next to you when you tell it. Finn looked at the fire again. He's going to try to say I'm lying, he said. Granger. He'll say I made it up, that I ran away for no reason, that He used to say we were ungrateful, that he fed us and housed us and we were ungrateful. He probably will say that. And people might believe him. Some might, Gareth said. Some people believe what's easier, but truth has a shape to it that's hard to fake, especially when it comes from a child. And Granger's kind of man say, he's made enemies. Men like that always have. Finn was quiet. The fire settled. I don't want Elsie to have to go, he said abruptly. To court. She shouldn't have to see all of that. Gareth looked at him. She'll probably come. She'd be furious if I left her behind. The edge of Finn's mouth moved. She would be. But that's a problem for spring, Gareth said. Right now you need to sleep. You went into cold water today and your body used up a lot just getting back. Finn stood. He was steadier now, color fully returned, the shaking long gone. He was a different shape than he'd been a month ago. Still thin, but differently so. The hollowed-out look of starvation giving way to something leaner and more itself. At the foot of the loft ladder he stopped. Gareth, he said. Gareth looked up from the fire. What you said. Before. When we got out. He didn't look directly at him, a kind of sideways address, like looking at something bright. You meant it? Gareth knew what he was asking. Because you're mine. 3 words, out before he'd thought them through, and true in a way that apparently needed confirmation. Yeah, he said. I meant it. Finn nodded once, a small, contained nod. Then he went up the ladder. Yes. The letter from Eldon Graves arrived 11 days later, carried by the post rider on a morning when the sky was doing something almost like thinking about clearing. Gareth read it at the table while the children ate breakfast. It was 3 pages in small, close handwriting. Graves was clearly a man who didn't waste paper. And it said several things in careful, measured language that could be summarized roughly as, this is complicated. The guardianship papers may be real or forged, and the difference matters enormously. I know the name Silas Granger, and it is a name with weight behind it in certain quarters, and you will need to come to Redhaven when the mountain road is passable. He also said, bring the boy. His testimony is going to be the center of everything. Prepare him for that. Gareth folded the letter and set it face down on the table. He looked at Finn, who was watching him over the rim of his coffee cup. Gareth had started giving him coffee, cut with hot water, because the boy drank it with such evident pleasure, and there was something warming about watching him discover that a cup of something hot in the morning was a thing a person could simply have. The lawyer wrote back, Gareth said. Finn put the cup down. And? And he says we have a case. He says it'll be a fight. But we have a case. Finn absorbed this. He wants me to testify. Yes? A pause. Elsie, who had been eating and listening with the practiced subtlety of a child who had learned that being obviously interested made adults stop talking, looked between them and said nothing. I'll do it, Finn said. He said it quickly, which meant he'd made the decision already, before Gareth had even shown him the letter. Maybe before the letter arrived. Maybe the morning after the river, when he'd said, I keep thinking about the ones still there, and understood, somewhere in the saying of it, what that meant for what came next. It won't be easy, Gareth said. He'll have lawyers. He'll try to make you look. I know what he'll try, Finn said. His voice had that flatness again, the old flatness, but with something underneath it now that hadn't been there before, something that was not defeat. He tried it on us at the camp all the time, told us nobody would believe us, that we were nobody. He picked up the coffee cup again. He was wrong about a lot of things. Gareth looked at him. Outside, the wind had dropped. Through the window, for the first time in weeks, the sky was pale and clear, and almost from a certain angle looked like it was thinking about spring. When the road opens, Gareth said, we go to Redhaven. Finn nodded. All 3 of us, Elsie announced. Gareth looked at her. I thought you were eating. I was eating and listening, she said. All three of us. I want to help. What are you going to do in a courtroom? She considered this with complete seriousness. I'll sit next to Finn, she said, so he knows somebody's there. Gareth looked at Finn. Finn looked at Elsie. Okay, Finn said. Yeah. Okay. The fire burned. The sky held its pale clarity outside the window. The mountain road would be weeks still, maybe more. The Bitterstone passes didn't open their fists until they were ready. But somewhere past the cold and the waiting and whatever Silas Granger was planning in the meantime, spring was coming. And with it, a reckoning that had been a long time building. The mountain road opened on the 1st of April, which was either auspicious or ironic, and Gareth couldn't decide which. The thaw came the way it always did in the Bitterstone Highlands. Not gradually, not with any kind of warning or grace, but all at once, like the mountain had been holding its breath for 4 months and finally exhaled. Snow that had been solid for weeks turned soft and gray and mean underfoot, the kind that soaked through boot leather in 20 minutes. The creek behind the cabin went from frozen silence to a roar that could be heard from inside with the door shut. The trail down to the main road became a thing of mud and exposed rock, and the particular misery of terrain that couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Gareth gave it a week before he attempted it with the horse and the children. He spent that week writing back to Graves with the additional details the lawyer had asked for. Specific dates, specific descriptions, the names Finn remembered from the camp, the name of the boy Tobias who had not survived his illness in the storage shed. Finn had provided these in the evenings, sitting at the table with Gareth while Elsie slept, going through them methodically, the way someone goes through something painful that they've decided to go through anyway. Not crying, not shutting down, just talking, carefully, with the particular exhausted steadiness of someone who has already made their peace with the cost of telling the truth. Some nights were harder than others. There was a night where Finn sat for 10 minutes without speaking after Gareth asked about the winter of his first year at the camp, and then said, very quietly, "I don't want to talk about that one tonight." And Gareth said, "All right," and put the paper down, and they sat by the fire and didn't talk about it. And that was that. The next night, Finn came to the table himself, before Gareth had even suggested it, and picked up where they'd left off. He was building something. Gareth could see it. Building the testimony the way you build a wall, stone by stone, testing each one for weight before you set it, making sure it would hold. The morning they left, Elsie was up before both of them, already dressed, already wearing the expression she wore when she had decided something was an occasion. She had brushed her hair, which she normally resisted as an assault on her personal freedom, and she was wearing her second-best dress under her coat, which was a choice Gareth didn't question because he'd learned long ago to pick his battles. "You look nice," Finn said, coming down the ladder. "I know," Elsie said. "It's important to look serious for court." "You learned that where?" "I decided it just now." She handed him a biscuit from the plate on the stove. "Eat. We're going, Ma." Redhaven was 2 days' ride from the cabin, 1 day from Millhaven if you pushed, and it was the kind of town that reminded you there was a wider world whether you wanted to be reminded or not. It had a proper main street with buildings that had glass windows and painted signs, a telegraph office, 3 hotels of varying quality, and a territorial courthouse that sat at the north end of Main Street with the self-important solidity of a building that knew it mattered. They arrived on a Wednesday evening, road dirty and tired, and checked into the cheapest of the 3 hotels, which was called the Drover's Rest, and smelled like its clientele, but had beds that were sound and a dining room that served hot food. Elsie ate an entire plate of beans and cornbread and fell asleep sitting upright at the table, and Gareth carried her upstairs and came back down to find Finn still at the table, not eating, staring at the door. "He's here," Finn said. "Granger. I saw one of his men on the street when we rode in." Gareth sat down. "All right." "He's had 2 months to prepare. He'll have better lawyers than us. He'll have—" Finn stopped himself. "He knows people here. You said he does. Graves said he does. Graves also said he knows which people Granger knows, which helps. Does it help enough? Help?" Gareth considered lying, decided against it. "I don't know. But I know that what you have to say is true, and true things are harder to bury than Granger thinks." Finn looked at him. "You ever been to court before?" "Twice? Neither time for anything like this. So you don't actually know how it works?" "Not well," Gareth admitted. "That's what Graves is for. Finn was quiet for a moment. Then, what if they don't believe me? Then we appeal. Then we find another way. Gareth leaned forward. Finn, I need you to hear this. Whatever happens in that room tomorrow, I am not walking out of it with a different answer than the one I gave you on that mountain. You're not going back. That's not a thing that's on the table, regardless of what the judge says, regardless of what Granger's lawyers say. We will find another way if this one doesn't work. You understand? Finn looked at him for a long moment. That's not very legal, he said. No, Gareth agreed. Something shifted in Finn's expression, not quite a smile, more like a loosening. Okay, he said. He picked up his fork and started eating. Okay. Eldon Graves was a small man in his 50s with a gray beard trimmed close and the kind of eyes that moved quickly and missed very little. He met them outside the courthouse at 8:30 the next morning, looked Finn over with a frank professional assessment, shook his hand like he was shaking a grown man's hand, which Gareth noticed and suspected Finn noticed, and then walked them through what the morning would look like. The case was formally a guardianship dispute. Granger's position was that he held legal guardianship of Finn Mercer, granted by a territorial magistrate 18 months ago, and that the child had been removed from his care unlawfully. Gareth's position, which Graves had constructed with careful attention to language, was that the guardianship had been obtained fraudulently, that the minor had been subjected to conditions constituting abuse and forced labor, and that the welfare of the child required its immediate and permanent termination. It sounds simple when you say it that way, Gareth said. It never is, Graves said. Granger's lawyer is a man named Aldous Price. He is competent and unpleasant, and his approach will be to make this about the legality of the paperwork rather than about what happened to children at that facility. He will try to keep this narrow. Our job is to keep it from being narrow. How? Finn asked. Graves looked at him. By you telling the truth, specifically and in detail, in a way that makes narrow impossible. He paused. I won't pretend this is easy. Price will try to make you doubt yourself. He'll suggest you're confused or lying or ungrateful. He'll use words that make the camp sound like charity. A pause. Can you hold? Finn met his eyes. Yes. Graves held the look for a moment, then nodded once. Good. Stay with what you know. If you don't know, say so. If you're not sure, say you're not sure. The moment you overreach, he'll use it. Stay on what you actually remember. I remember everything, Finn said. Graves nodded again, slower this time. I believe you. The courtroom was smaller than Gareth had expected, and louder. Benches on both sides already half filled when they came in, because a guardianship case in Red Haven wasn't common entertainment, but it was more interesting than the alternatives. Gareth scanned the room automatically, the way he scanned terrain, looking for the shape of things. Granger was already seated at the opposing table. He wore a dark suit that fit him better than the road coat from the cabin visit, and he looked exactly like what he was. A man who owned things and intended to keep owning them and had the patience to let the legal process do his work for him. His lawyer, Price, was seated beside him, lean and pale with a stack of papers that he was organizing with the deliberate calm of a man performing competence. Granger looked up when Finn came in. He didn't look at Gareth. He looked at Finn, and his expression didn't change at all, which was in some ways worse than if it had. He just looked at the boy with the flat, possessive attention of someone looking at a piece of property that had gotten misplaced and was now back in the room where it belonged. Finn looked back. His jaw was tight, and his hands were still at his sides, and he looked back. Elsie, coming in beside them, took Finn's hand without being asked. They sat. The opening arguments were exactly what Graves had predicted. Prices were smooth and procedural. Mr. Granger holds legally obtained guardianship. The child was in his lawful care. The respondent Ashcombe has no legal claim and no legal standing. The court should restore the guardianship and address the matter of the unlawful removal. He said the word unlawful 4 times. Graves's argument was shorter and blunter. The guardianship was obtained through fraudulent misrepresentation. The facility operated by Mr. Granger subjected children under his supposed care to forced labor, malnutrition, physical abuse, and conditions that resulted in the death of at least one minor, and this court had the authority and the obligation to hear testimony establishing these facts before acting on any piece of paper, however official it appeared. The judge was a man named Harlan Wicks, 60-something, heavy through the chest, with the unhurried manner of someone who had heard a great many people argue about a great many things and had learned to wait for the part that actually mattered. He looked at Price's stack of papers and Graves's shorter stack and said, "We'll hear testimony. Respondent's witness first." Gareth went first. He was not a good witness in the technical sense. Too plain-spoken, too inclined to answer questions with other questions, too visibly unimpressed with the formalities. Price was polished and precise with him, establishing that Gareth had no legal relationship to the child, no documentation, no official standing. Gareth agreed with all of it. He sat in the witness chair with his hat on his knee and agreed that he had removed a child from the care of a legal guardian, and that he had done it deliberately, and that he would do it again. Price paused at that. "You would knowingly violate a legal guardianship order. I would take in a barefoot child sitting in 14 below temperatures at a winter market with no shoes and no coat," Gareth said. "Yes." The child's feet were damaged. He had the signs of someone who hadn't been eating right for a long time. He was alone and he was scared. That's what I saw." He paused. "You can call that violating a legal order if you want. I call it being a person." Price let the silence sit, apparently deciding the line of questioning wasn't helping him. He moved on to technical matters. The property, the distance from Millhaven, the trap lines, things that established nothing except that Gareth was a trapper with a mountain cabin, which everyone already knew. Graves's redirect was 2 questions. "Mr. Ashcombe, in the time that Finn Mercer has been in your care, has he received adequate food and shelter?" "Yes." "Has anyone struck him?" "No." Gareth stepped down. Finn walked to the witness chair without hesitating, which was the bravest thing Gareth had ever personally watched a person do. He sat down. He was too small for the chair in a way that should have looked diminished, but somehow didn't. He sat straight, hands flat on his knees, and looked at Graves, and Graves led him through it. What Graves had said the night before, "Stay with what you know," was exactly what Finn did. He described the camp in the methodical, specific way that people describe things they have lived through and cannot forget. Not dramatized, not performed, just detailed, in a voice that stayed even for most of it and cracked in 2 specific places. And the cracking in those 2 places was worse than anything dramatic could have been because it was real and the room could hear it. He described the timber work, hours, quotas, what happened when quotas weren't met. He described the food, what it was, how much, how often. He described the building they slept in and the single stove that didn't heat it adequately, and the winter when 3 children got sick and one of them was Tobias, and Tobias didn't come back out of the storage shed. He was specific about Tobias. He said his name, he said how old he was, what he looked like, that he had a gap in his front teeth, and a habit of counting things under his breath when he was nervous. He said it all looking at Graves, and then, when Graves asked him about it, he said, his name was Tobias Crane, and he was 7 years old, and he deserved better than a storage shed. The room was very quiet. Then Price stood up. He was good. Gareth had to give him that. He was disciplined and careful, and he came at Finn from angles that were hard to argue with directly. He questioned dates. "Are you certain it was January, not February?" He questioned specifics. "You said 3 children were sick, but earlier you said 2. Which is it?" He questioned motive. "You ran away because you didn't like the work. Isn't that more accurate?" Finn answered each one. He corrected the ones he'd actually misspoken on. "I said 2 in the first part and 3 in the second, because a third got sick in the same week. I'll clarify that." With a precision that was clearly not what Price had been expecting from a 10-year-old. He didn't get rattled. He got quieter and more specific each time Price pushed, which was the opposite of what Price's approach was designed to produce. Then Price said, "Isn't it true that Mr. Granger provided you with housing, meals, and skills training that would otherwise have been unavailable to an orphaned child with no family and no resources?" Finn looked at him for a moment. "He provided a floor to sleep on," he said. "Meals were twice a day when there wasn't a quota shortfall, and then it was once. Skills training means he rented us to other operations for labor and kept the money." He paused. "I'm an orphan. I know what that means, and I know what he thought it meant. He thought it meant nobody was going to come looking." Another pause, and his voice went flat and even and deliberate. He was wrong about that. Price pivoted. Do you have any documentation? Any evidence beyond your own account? I have names, Finn said, of every child who was there when I left, and of 3 who aren't there anymore. If someone goes to that camp and looks, they'll find the ones who are still there. He met Price's eyes. Unless he's already moved them. The last sentence landed the way Finn seemed to know it would. Not in Price's face, but in the room. Several people on the benches shifted. Someone in the back made a sound. Price retreated to his table. What broke the afternoon open was not Finn, in the end. It was a man named Cutter who showed up at the courthouse at the noon recess and asked to speak to Graves. Gareth and Finn were eating bread and cheese on the courthouse steps. Elsie was inside with Graves. When Graves came out with a man Gareth didn't recognize, 50s, weathered, with a sheepman's coat and the look of someone who has spent time deciding whether to do something and has finally decided. "This is Walt Cutter," Graves said. "He runs a wool operation 2 valleys over from Granger's facility. He has something to say that I think the judge needs to hear this afternoon." Cutter looked at Finn. Something moved in his face. "You're the boy who ran," he said. "Yes, sir." Cutter looked at Gareth. "I hired labor from Granger 3 times over 2 years. He sent me boys to help with shearing. I paid him, not them." He stopped. "I told myself it was legal, that he was their guardian and I was paying their keep." A pause. "Then one of them, maybe 12 years old, asked me if I could take him with me when I left. Just asked me. Like he knew I was going to say no, but had to try anyway." He looked at his hands. I said no. Told him to get back to work. He looked up. "Been thinking about that for 8 months." Graves said, "He's willing to testify to Granger's labor hiring practice and to what he personally witnessed regarding the conditions of the children." Finn looked at the man for a long moment. Then he said, "The 12-year-old, was his name Reed?" Cutter stared at him. I didn't ask his name." "Skinny kid, red hair, freckles." A pause. "Could have been." Finn nodded. He looked at Graves. "Reed was still there when I left. He'd been there 3 years. Graves was already turning back to the courthouse. We go back in at 1. Cutter's testimony took 40 minutes, and it dismantled Price's careful procedural architecture, the way a real thing always dismantles an argument built around paperwork. He wasn't dramatic about it. He just described what he'd seen, in a sheepman's blunt language. And the courtroom listened the way rooms listen to things they recognize as true. Price's cross-examination was brief. There was not much he could do with an eyewitness who wasn't testifying about Granger's papers or Gareth's legal standing, just a man describing children who'd been sent to his property to work and who'd asked to leave with him when he went. After Cutter stepped down, Graves made a motion. He asked the court to order an immediate welfare inspection of Granger's facility by the county sheriff, independent of the guardianship question, on the basis of 2 independent testimonies establishing likely harm to minors currently in residence. Price objected, argued procedure, argued timing. Judge Wickes looked at him over the top of his glasses with the expression of a man who had heard enough and said, "Motion granted." It was a small thing, 2 words. But Gareth, watching from his seat, saw Granger's composure shift for the first time. Not collapse, not even crack, just shift, like something behind the face had moved. A recalculation. Price leaned to him and they conferred in whispers. Then Price stood. "Your Honor, we would request a brief recess to review our position." Judge Wickes gave them 30 minutes. What happened in those 30 minutes, Gareth never learned in full. What emerged afterward was that Granger's position had become more complicated than his lawyer could manage, because the welfare inspection order meant someone was going to go to that facility and find what was there to be found, and whatever was there to be found was apparently enough to change the calculation significantly. When Price returned to the courtroom, he did not look like a man who had used the recess well. He stood and said, in the even tone of someone performing calm, that his client wished to address the question of the guardianship papers directly, and that certain irregularities had come to his attention that he felt obliged to bring before the court. Graves, beside Gareth, made a very small sound that might have been satisfaction. Price went through it with the pained efficiency of a man who understood the position had changed and was trying to control the terms of the reversal. The guardianship papers had been filed with a magistrate named Colin Pratt. Magistrate Pratt, it emerged, had since relocated under circumstances that had not been fully examined. The signatures on 2 of the supporting documents, upon review, presented certain questions. He did not use the word forged. He used the phrase procedural inconsistencies. Judge Wicks looked at the papers for a long time. Then he looked at Granger, who was looking at the table with the face of a man who has made the decision not to give anything away that isn't already gone. "Mr. Granger," the judge said, "I'm going to speak plainly. This court has received 2 independent testimonies describing conditions at your facility that, if accurate, would represent serious criminal offenses against multiple minors. I now have before me documentation with procedural inconsistencies significant enough to question the legitimacy of the guardianship underlying this entire proceeding." A pause. "Do you have anything to say in direct response to the testimony given this morning?" Granger looked up. He looked at the judge and then, briefly, at Finn, and Finn held it without flinching. "I run a legitimate operation," Granger said. "I have provided for children who would otherwise have nothing." "That's not a response to the testimony," the judge said. "That's a statement." He set the papers down. "We'll recess until tomorrow morning. I will review the documentation overnight. Mr. Graves, I'd like your written summary of the testimony on my desk by 8. He stood. Everyone stood. Gareth let out a breath he'd been holding for about 6 hours. Beside him, Finn sat still for a moment, then reached across and took Elsie's hand. She'd been next to him all afternoon, exactly as she'd promised, quiet and present. And then he put his head down and Gareth realized the boy's shoulders were shaking. Not crying, just something releasing. The way a rope looks when the tension finally goes. Gareth put his hand on Finn's shoulder and didn't say anything, because there was nothing that needed to be said right then. The day had been long, and the boy had been extraordinary, and the morning would bring whatever it brought. For now they sat, the 3 of them in the emptying courtroom, and Gareth felt the particular exhausted solidarity of people who have been in something hard together, and outside on the street of Red Haven, the afternoon light was going gold and low, and somewhere in the direction of the Bitterstone Highlands, a sheriff's deputy was already riding toward a facility past the second fork in the road, and everything that had been hidden there was about to stop being hidden. It wasn't over, but it had turned. Judge Wicks came back the next morning with the look of a man who had not slept well and had made his peace with that. The courtroom was fuller than the day before. Word had moved through Red Haven the way word moved through small territorial towns, quickly, selectively, with a certain amount of embellishment that the facts didn't actually need. People stood along the back wall. Gareth recognized Walt Cutter among them, hat in his hands, and 2 men he didn't recognize who had the look of territorial officials, the kind who appeared when something was happening that might require official appearances. Graves had told them before they went in that the sheriff's deputy had reached Granger's facility the previous evening. He hadn't said what they found. His expression had said enough. Granger was at his table. Price was beside him, but the stack of papers was smaller today, and Price had the particular stillness of a lawyer who knows what the morning holds and is professionally obligated to sit through it anyway. Judge Wicks settled into his chair, set his hands flat on the bench, and looked at the room for a moment before he spoke. "I reviewed the documentation presented yesterday at length," he said. "I also received a preliminary report from Deputy Caro, who conducted a welfare inspection of the Granger facility last evening." He paused. There was no theater in it, just a man saying what needed to be said in the order it needed to be said. "That report documents the presence of 9 minor children in conditions I am not going to describe in detail in this courtroom, but which this court is obligated to treat as a matter requiring immediate criminal referral to the territorial prosecutor's office." The room shifted, not loudly. The kind of shift that moves through people when they hear something they half expected and hoped not to. "Regarding the guardianship papers," Wicks continued, "my review identifies irregularities consistent with fraudulent filing. The signature attributed to Magistrate Colin Pratt on the primary document does not match authenticated samples from his official records. I am referring this matter to the territorial attorney as well." He looked at Granger. "Mr. Granger, I am voiding the guardianship of Finn Mercer on the grounds of fraudulent procurement. Furthermore, based on the testimony and evidence before this court, I am ordering your immediate detention pending criminal investigation." Price stood, started to say something about appeals and process. Wickies looked at him with the patience of a man who had genuinely run out of patience and said, "Mr. Price, I would encourage you to choose your next words carefully." Price sat down. Two men appeared at Granger's side, courthouse deputies, quiet and efficient about it. Granger stood. He didn't look at Finn. He didn't look at Gareth. He looked straight ahead at the middle distance with an expression that had finally gone unreadable in a way that was worse than anything calculated, and he walked out with the deputies, and that was the last Gareth ever saw of him. The room exhaled. Graves had prepared the adoption petition separately because he was the kind of man who prepared for outcomes and didn't wait to see which one arrived before getting the paperwork ready. He put it before Wickies while the courtroom was still settling, and Wickies looked it over, asked Gareth 3 questions in a tone that was considerably warmer than anything that had come before it, and signed it. It took about 4 minutes. Finn Mercer became Finn Mercer Ashcombe on a Thursday morning in April, in a territorial courtroom in Red Haven, with a judge who looked like he hadn't slept and a lawyer who had prepared for everything, and a 6-year-old girl who started crying almost immediately and claimed afterward that she had not been crying. She had something in her eye. Gareth looked at the signed paper in his hand. It was not beautiful. It was a bureaucratic document on official paper with a seal and a signature and a case number, and it was the most important thing he had held since Elsie the morning she was born. He looked at Finn, who was looking at the paper too, and the boy's face had done the thing it did sometimes, cracked open briefly, the shutter open, the light coming through. "That's it?" Finn said. "That's it." Finn looked at Graves. "It's real. It can't be. He can't appeal it, or—" "The guardianship was fraudulent," Graves said. "There's nothing to appeal from. You're his." He paused. "Legally and otherwise, I'd say." Finn looked at Gareth. Gareth folded the paper and put it inside his coat, close to his chest, and put his hand on the back of Finn's neck the way he sometimes did with Elsie, briefly, firmly, and said, "Let's go home." They stayed in Red Haven 2 more days because Graves needed additional statements, and because the territorial prosecutor's office sent a man named Aldous Farrow who wanted to speak to Finn directly about what he knew of the other children and the operation's structure. Finn sat across from Farrow in a small office at the back of the courthouse and answered every question for 2 hours with the same methodical precision he'd brought to the courtroom. He gave names. He gave descriptions. He gave a rough map of the facility layout that he drew from memory, the dormitory building and the work yard and the timber stands to the northeast and the storage shed where Tobias had been put. When he talked about Tobias, his voice stayed even now. The grief was there, but it had been placed somewhere. Not buried, not performed, just set in a particular part of him where it was real and bearable at the same time. After, in the hallway outside Farrow's office, Finn leaned against the wall and didn't say anything for a while. Gareth stood beside him. Elsie had gone with Graves to look at the courthouse library, which she'd been campaigning for since she noticed it the day before. "Reed was there," Finn said finally. "The red-haired kid. I gave Farrow his name." "I heard. They're going to go back and get them all out?" "That's what Farrow said. The investigation starts this week." Finn nodded. He looked at the ceiling. "I keep thinking, if I hadn't run when I did, if I'd waited another month, another week even." He stopped. The ice on the river was thinner in March. "I knew it. I waited until it was almost too late to run." "But you didn't wait until it was too late," Gareth said. "I almost did." "Almost doesn't count for as much as people think it does," Gareth said. "You ran. You made it. You're here. Those kids are going to get out because you testified." He paused. "That's what happened. Everything else is a version of events that didn't." Finn looked at him sideways. "That's a strange way to think about it." "I've had a lot of time alone on a mountain," Gareth said. "You develop strange ways of thinking about things." The edge of Finn's mouth moved. "Elsie said you used to talk to the horse." "I still talk to the horse." "She said you have long conversations." "The horse is a good listener." Finn laughed. The real one. The one that took over his whole face. And Gareth let it happen and didn't say anything else. And after a moment, the laughter settled and they stood together in the corridor of the Red Haven courthouse in the ordinary April afternoon. Just a man and a boy who had come through something and were still standing on the other side of it. The road home was easier than the road out. Whether that was the weather or the direction or something else, Gareth couldn't have said precisely. The Bitterstone passes were still cold, but the sky was doing something different. Higher, bluer. the particular quality of spring sky that meant the worst was behind and the land was starting to consider other options. Elsie rode in front of Gareth and gave a continuous commentary on everything they passed, and Finn rode alongside on the spare horse that Gareth had brought for the return trip. And at some point in the afternoon of the first day, Finn started responding to Elsie's commentary with observations of his own. There. That rock formation. It looks like Deputy from the side, does it? It doesn't. It does. The beak is right there. That's not a beak. It's a crack. And their voices went back and forth while the horses picked their way up the mountain road, and Gareth listened to them without participating and felt something settle in him that had been unsettled for a very long time. Not peace exactly. He'd learned not to call things peace because peace implied the absence of difficulty, and difficulty on the frontier was permanent and structural, and you were a fool if you thought otherwise. More like alignment, the feeling of things being in the right place, which was different. He thought about Daniel. He thought about Daniel the way he'd been trying not to for years, directly and without the sideways approach he'd developed. The 9-year-old on the ice of Coldwater Creek, the 16-year-old on the bank, the scream for help that came too late. He had built a life around that afternoon. Not intentionally, not in the way of a man who makes a plan, but in the way of a man who loses his footing and then adjusts everything to compensate for it. Gone up the mountain, kept to himself, loved Margaret fiercely and quietly, and lost her, and kept Elsie and kept going, kept moving, kept the fire lit and the trap lines running and the days stacking up in the way that eventually became years. And then a market in January. A barefoot boy. A 6-year-old's question. He didn't think he'd saved Finn because of Daniel. That was too clean, too tidy, the kind of psychological accounting that made good stories and wasn't really how human beings worked. He'd brought Finn home because Elsie asked, and because he couldn't walk away, and because the child was barefoot in 14 below temperatures, and some things were simply intolerable, regardless of what they cost. But he thought that somewhere in it, in the crawling across the ice, and the rifle pointed at Granger's men, and the 2 days in a Red Haven courtroom, something had shifted in that old account. Not settled. He didn't think you settled those things exactly, but shifted. Changed in some small, weight-bearing way that made the whole structure sit differently. Daniel was still gone. That was permanent, and he'd made his peace with permanent. But Finn was not gone, and Finn was here, and that was also true and also permanent, and both things could be true at once. He was old enough to know that. Eat. They reached the cabin on the second evening, just as the light was going. The place looked the same. Of course it did. 2 days was 2 days. And cabins did not change in 2 days, but Gareth noticed things he'd stopped noticing through winter, the way the lean-to threw a shadow east at this hour, the state of the north wall where he'd re-chinked it, the woodpile low but not desperate, the quality of silence that was specific to this elevation and this exposure and nowhere else in the world that he knew of. Elsie was off the horse before he'd finished dismounting, running for the lean-to check on Sergeant and Deputy, who received her return with the indifference chickens reserved for all human emotion. "They're fine," she announced. "Deputy has a new feather. Sergeant is judging us." "Sergeant is always judging us," Finn said. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, looking at the cabin with an expression Gareth had seen on his face in the Drover's Rest hotel room that first evening in Red Haven. The man checking if the water is real look, but different now. Less guarded. "What?" Gareth said. Finn shook his head slightly. "Nothing, it's just..." He stopped, started differently. "I used to think about having somewhere. When I was at the camp, I used to think about it at night, what it would be like. Having a door you could close." He looked at the cabin. "I couldn't really picture it. I tried, but I couldn't make it feel real." "And now?" Finn looked at him. "Now it just looks like home," he said. Simply, without drama, which made it more true than anything dramatic could have been. Gareth looked at the cabin too. It was not a beautiful building. It was a functional one, put together by a man who was better at trapping than carpentry, improved over years in the slow way frontier structures got improved. A better door, a sounder roof, the north wall chinking that kept the cold out adequately, if not perfectly. It had no beauty beyond the specific beauty of things that have kept people alive through difficult winters, which was its own kind of beauty if you knew how to look. "Go get the fire started," Gareth said. "It'll be cold inside." Finn went, They ate late that night. Beans and salt pork that Gareth had left in the cold pantry, good enough, hot enough, eaten at the table by all three of them, with the specific appetite of people who have been through something and come out the other side still upright and hungry. Elsie gave a detailed account of everything she'd seen in the Red Haven Courthouse library, which was considerable, and Finn ate steadily and asked occasional questions, and Gareth drank his coffee and let the conversation run without him for a while. After Elsie went up to the loft, Gareth and Finn stayed at the table in the way they'd gotten used to over the winter, not always talking, comfortable enough in the quiet, the fire doing its work, the mountain doing what mountains did at night. Pharaoh said the investigation would take a few months, Finn said. Probably. They'll find what I said they'd find. I know. Finn turned the coffee cup in his hands. Reed's going to need somewhere to go. After. Some of the others will too. He wasn't looking at Gareth when he said it, looking at the fire. I don't know how that works, where they put kids when… Finn. The boy looked up. One thing at a time, Gareth said. Let Pharaoh do his job. Let the investigation happen. When it's done and those kids are out, we'll see what they need. He paused. I'm not saying no to anything you're thinking. I'm saying give it time to be a real question before you try to answer it. Finn looked at him for a moment. You'd actually think about it? Taking in… I said one thing at a time. But you didn't say no. No, Gareth said. I didn't say no. Finn turned the cup again. The fire settled. Outside, the mountain wind moved through the trees above the cabin in its familiar low register, the sound Gareth had fallen asleep to for years, the sound that had felt like loneliness for a long time, and now felt like something else he didn't have a name for. You know what I keep thinking about? Finn said. What? That morning at the market. You almost didn't stop. He said it without accusation, just turning the fact over, examining it. I could see you trying to decide. You stood there, and I could see you arguing with yourself. I wasn't arguing for very long, Gareth said. No, Finn said. But you were. He paused. I noticed. I always notice when people are deciding whether I'm worth the trouble. A breath. Most people decide no pretty fast. Gareth looked at the fire. Most people have more sense than me. Finn made a sound that was halfway to a laugh. Maybe. He set the cup down. I'm glad you don't. He went up the ladder. Gareth sat at the table for a while after. He did that sometimes, not thinking about anything specifically, just sitting in the space the day left when it was over, letting things settle before he went to bed. The fire had gone to coals and he didn't build it back up. The room would hold the warmth for another hour or two. He thought about the things he'd been given in the last 4 months and what they'd cost and whether the accounting made sense. It didn't. Not in any mathematical way. You didn't take in a strange child in the middle of winter and crawl across bad ice and sit in a territorial courthouse and come out ahead on any ledger you could calculate. The ledger didn't work that way, but Gareth had long since given up on the ledger. He looked at the 3 coats on the pegs by the door. His and Elsie's and the sheepskin coat he'd bought at the market from the second-hand cart. Too big when he bought it, fitting better now, belonging to a boy who had asked him why when he crawled across the ice and gotten an answer that was true even when Gareth hadn't planned it. Because you're mine. 3 words. Out before he thought them. Still the most accurate thing he'd said in years. He had come up the mountain after Daniel because the mountain didn't care, and sometimes you needed to be somewhere that didn't care, that just sat there in its permanence and let you be small against it. He had stayed because of Margaret, and then because of Elsie, and then because staying had become the only motion he knew. And then January had happened, and the market, and a barefoot boy, and now the cabin held 3 coats and 3 breathing people and 2 chickens with opinions, and somewhere down the mountain in the spring mud the world was turning and a sheriff's office was building a case, and 9 children in a facility past the second fork in the Bitterstone Road were going to be taken out of there and placed somewhere better, because a boy named Finn had been cold enough and brave enough and desperate enough to run, and had run far enough to land in a January market where a man who should have kept walking didn't. Gareth wasn't going to make it into a lesson. He was suspicious of lessons, generally. They were too clean, and his life had not been clean. But he thought there was something in it that was true and worth keeping, the way you kept tools that actually worked, that the decision to not walk past something, to not look away, to not tell yourself it's somebody else's problem, that decision costs something. It always costs something. But what it gives back is not nothing. It is, in fact, the thing that makes the rest of it, the getting up, the keeping going, the fire lit in the morning, feel like it's pointed somewhere worth pointing. He had been a man hiding from grief on a mountain. He was still on the mountain. The grief was still there, in the way grief is always there, the stone in the boot you learn to walk with. But hiding was done. He got up from the table, banked the coals, and went to bed. In the loft above him, 2 children were asleep. One who had never seriously doubted the world meant her well, and one who had spent 2 years learning the opposite and was slowly, unevenly, with setbacks and nightmares and nights where the fire needed extra wood, learning something different. Both of them, his. Outside, the bitter stone highlands were what they always were. Indifferent, enormous, neither cruel nor kind. Snow still on the high ridges, gone from the low trails, the creek running fast with the melt, spring doing what spring did in its slow, unsentimental way. The mountain had not changed. Gareth had. That was enough.